Well, welcome to week 6 of our class on exegesis for ministry and focusing on the Gospel of Matthew. Hard to believe we're in week 6. There's a lot of things we've gotten into and a lot of things we've covered, and hopefully everything's building on building together, working together to create sort of this echo chamber of learning, where things from week 1 are starting to echo and bounce around with things from week 4, and all the stuff's connecting, along with then the exegesis that you're doing on particular passages in Matthew's Gospel. We are at the point in this class now, from here on out, where we will be dealing with more topical issues related to the exegesis and interpretation of Matthew's Gospel in 2-week chunks. And so this first 2 weeks we will dwell with the way that Matthew presents Jesus. We're going to talk and read about and discuss and focus on Christology. What sort of Jesus does Matthew give us? And if we had more time, we would do some comparison with how Matthew's Jesus is distinct from Mark's and from Luke's, and then also how they overlap a little bit. And we'll do a little of that, but we really want to focus the next 2 weeks on what's the Jesus that we get in Matthew's Gospel. So, but again, the flow of the course from here on out will be 2-week divisions. Every 2 weeks we will dwell with a different theme related to exegesis of Matthew's Gospel. And this first one is on Jesus. For this next 2 weeks, then, we're going to focus on how does Matthew's narrative present to us this figure that has such immense value, and that at the end of the narrative in Matthew 28 is called Lord and has all authority in heaven and on earth. We're going to focus on exactly, how does Matthew go about doing it, through the teaching, through the narrative, through the titles used for Jesus throughout the narrative. So we want to focus on this next 2 weeks as we talk about who Jesus is in Matthew's Gospel. Particularly a few things that I think we want to have in mind as we do this. First thing is the first 4 chapters of Matthew's Gospel, chapters 1 through 4, basically up to when Jesus calls disciples in 4:20, 4:16, something like that, 4:18 I think it is. All of that material in the first 4 chapters are absolutely foundational for presenting Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. They really set the tone. And so at the least, you want to reread those four chapters and get a sense of what's going on there. And I would recommend doing that in conjunction with Carter's book, what he says, especially on pages 141 and 142, about the plot of Matthew's Gospel and what he says about the first 4 chapters. A couple things to draw attention to is that Carter highlights Jesus as God's presence on earth, okay? And that, might make a difference. It might make a difference how we parse that, sort of. Is Jesus God, or is Jesus God with us, God's presence with us in human form? And there's a distinction there. And throughout Christian history, there's been arguments about that. I think we confess that Jesus is in the very form God, but how is Jesus God with us? That's a big thing in Matthew's Gospel. And then secondly, Jesus is the fulfillment of a previous story. In fact, an ongoing story. The story of God's promises to Israel. And that's right at the get-go. That's a big part of how Matthew presents Jesus. The fulfillment, the climax of the covenant to Israel. And so that story of Israel will be informative for shaping how Jesus is understood. So Carter, pages 141, 142, kind of flesh that out a little bit, but it's good for us, good for you guys to probably reread the first 4 chapters of Matthew's Gospel to get a sense for that. And then how does this particular Jesus, who fulfills these promises, this story of Israel's history, how does he then become the universal Lord at the end of the Gospel? So there is a movement in Matthew's Gospel. And then this week's focal text, Matthew chapter 9, about Jesus and his encounter with tax collectors and sinners, and his quotation of Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That's a big part of how Matthew paints Jesus as well. So this passage we're translating this week is an important one for understanding who Jesus is and what he's all about. And how does then the fellowship with tax collectors and sinners and the citation of Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, how does that fit then with the fulfillment of the story of Israel? How does it fit with the reach to all nations? How does it fit with the way that Jesus is God with us? How do these things come together to create a picture of who Jesus is? We are also going to focus on the titles used for Jesus over the next couple weeks. Son of God, Son of Man, Messiah, Lord, Son of David. All these titles that are used. It's important to take a look at not only what these titles might have meant, but how does Matthew situate the titles within the narrative? And so how does the narrative help give shape to the titles used? And we will spend time on that, especially after Easter, but we'll start reading about that this week in Carter's book. And then a final question. With all of that stuff, of course, we want to be thinking about our contexts today. How do people understand Jesus today? Is there a need for a refresher in terms of understanding what Son of God really is all about? Do we throw around titles, Messiah, Son of God, too easily without really understanding the depth? Or are there ways we understand Jesus that are connected with American, Western political ideologies that simply are not Jesus-like? And how does Matthew's presentation of Jesus then challenge us to rethink who Jesus is and give us new eyes and new ways to live out who we are as followers of Jesus, and new eyes and new ways to think about who Jesus is for today? How does Matthew's Gospel do that? I'm sure it does. So the driving question is this, and it's the driving question in Matthew's Gospel. It's the hinge point in Matthew 16 when Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter gives an answer, and Jesus commends Peter for his answer, but then Jesus goes on to dismantle a little bit what Peter thought. And the question remains today, who do you say I am? That Jesus continues to ask that question, and I think continues to dismantle certain preconceived ideas of who we want Jesus to be. I think of that scene in the great classic movie Talladega Nights, where they have the prayer at the table, and everyone has their own Jesus that they like. And to a degree, Jesus is personal, but who is Jesus beyond what we want? Who is Jesus for the world? And I think that's the question that should drive our thoughts and discussion this week. Who do you say Jesus is? And how does Matthew's Gospel present a portrait of Jesus for us to answer that question?